Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be starting a new series on Bobby Fischer, and we're going to take a look at some of his most memorable games that he's ever played. Obviously, Bobby Fischer, being one of the greatest chess players that's ever played, has played some extremely epic matches, and you can learn a lot from his matches. So I thought this would be a great series to start with, and the first game we're going to be looking at today comes from his very first U.S. championship. It was back in 1957. At the time, he was only 14 years of age, and in 1957 he actually had his second best record ever. A few years later he would actually have a perfect 11 points, but in this one he ended up winning at the ripe age of 14. The next year he actually went on to become the youngest grandmaster of all time, so he's not quite at that level yet. He's still very young, but extremely talented for his age. And so in this championship we're going to be looking at one of his matches is between James Sherwin, at the time a 24-year-old player, actually got third in this tournament, so an extremely accomplished U.S. player in his own right. And Bobby Fischer in this match is going to be playing the white pieces. James Sherwin's going to be defending with the black piece. Bobby Fischer starts off with pawn e4, pawn c5. This is the Sicilian defense, so if you're not familiar, I definitely recommend checking out that video. But continues with knight f3, pawn d6, pawn d4, and then after capture, the knight recaptures knight f6, just development moves, knight c3, and then pawn to a6. Black has a lot of different variations that he could go into. He could try some of the dragon lines. In this particular defense, James Sherwin decided to play the knight dwarf, just this pawn to a6. And this is one of the most common defenses that you'll see in top-level play. Again, Bobby Fischer, a huge proponent of this pawn to e4, and so the Sicilian defense knight dwarf variation is extremely popular for black at high level. Bobby Fischer is going to continue with bishop to c4. Again, development move, trying to control the center of the board, also attacking this pawn here in f7. Sherwin's going to respond with pawn to e6, kind of blocking off, getting ready to have this solid pawn chain right here. But wants to make sure this light square bishop isn't doing a whole heck of a lot. Bobby Fischer's going to castle on the king side, and then black's going to start a little counter attack and try to push forward and put some pressure on this bishop on c4. The bishop's just going to come back here to b3, and black's not done, going to push forward with his pawn here to c3. Now Bobby Fischer plays knight to b1. Not really the more common moves that you'll see from white. Underdeveloping your pieces back here to b1, usually kind of frowned upon. It's more common to see, knight to a4. Still somewhat of an active piece. You never want to have your knights on the edge here, but it's going to be very easy later for him to get involved into the game. A move like knight to c5. After this pawn moves, you can always place pawn right here or pawn here on b4 and have a nice little outpost. But Bobby Fischer plays knight to b1, and then the bishop's going to come here to d7. Again, getting all the pieces developed into the game. Bobby Fischer going to play bishop to e3, getting his dark square bishop involved into the game. The knight's going to come here to c6, and then Bobby Fischer is going to play pawn to f3. Now, black did have the option here. He could have played knight takes here on e4, which wouldn't have been all that bad. He decided not to. Instead, he decided to just play knight to c6, and then the pawn's going to come here to f3 and protect this pawn. Black responds with bishop to f7, getting all of his minor pieces involved into the game. Center of the board right here, both of his bishops connected and the knights over here, so that he can castle on the king side. Bobby Fischer's now going to play pawn to c3. What Bobby Fischer really wants is, he wants this pawn to recapture so that his knight can recapture here on c3. This would be best case scenario for Bobby Fischer, that he can recapture and get his knight back involved into the game. Now after this pawn to c3, black actually did respond, and he took with his pawn here on c3. He did have different options. He could have played something like pawn to a5. That way, if the pawn takes here on b4 and the pawn recaptures, this is opening up this a file for this rook here. It's also really holding down, this square here on c3. Again, Bobby Fischer wants to get this knight involved into the game, so this is just going to be a thorn in his side for the time being. So, again, definitely not the recommended way, just to do exactly what Bobby Fischer wants you to do. But the pawn's going to take right here, and then Bobby Fischer first takes with his knight here on c6. And then after the bishop takes on c6, Bobby Fischer is going to play knight takes on c3. Again, he now has all of his minor pieces involved into the board. He's controlling the center of the board. Next thing he needs to do is get his queen, He's connected his rooks on the back row, and then he can really start to attack his opponent. Now black responds with castling on the king side. Again, king side safety is always important. Bobby Fischer now plays rook to c1. You want to get your rooks active squares, meaning you want to get them in open files, semi-open files, so they can roam around the board. Again, if you have your rooks that aren't active, you're going to have a huge piece that's not really doing a whole heck of a lot in the game. So rook to c1, nice little move. The queen's going to come over here to b8, nice little active square, putting a lot of pressure on the queen side from Bobby Fischer here. And then Bobby Fischer plays knight to d5. Really, really aggressive square. He could have, played knight to e2, opening up for his rook to come to c6, putting a lot of pressure on that open file. He decides instead to play knight to d5. Now in the game, Sherman actually took with his pawn here on d5. Probably would have made more sense if he captured with his knight here on d5. Bobby Fischer has a lot of different ways that he can recapture, but at the end of the day, the end solution is Bobby Fischer doesn't have a super aggressive position. In the actual game, the pawn took here on d5, and then after the rook took on c6, and then the pawns come off the board. This is going to be very aggressive for Bobby Fischer. Obviously, you can tell right here that his rook is on the c6 file, very aggressive. He has both of his bishops here kind of dominating the center of the board. And this dark square bishop for James Sherwin isn't doing a whole heck of a lot. So, again, this is the position that Sherwin ended up with. Probably would have made more sense if instead he captured with his knight here on d5. From here, black plays queen to b5. Pretty active square. He could have just played knight to e4, but he does get into some problems with bishop here to d5. Again, he has a discovered attack if he moves his rook. So he decides, okay, I don't want to have to deal with that, even though I gain material there. So instead, he just decides to play queen here to b5, and then the rook swings over to b6. Now, again, black's in not the worst shape ever. He's definitely going to need to get his dark square bishop involved into the game, but he could play a move like queen to d7 here. Still pretty active, controlling a lot of these light squares in the center of the board. Also, protecting this pawn here. This is going to be completely okay. Unfortunately for black, he makes a huge error in the game, and he plays queen over to e5. Again, just not doing a whole heck of a lot for him, and this bishop can now come to d4. Much better square for Bobby Fischer here. Much active, controlling the center of the board. And now black's just kind of responding. He has no real game plan, and Bobby Fischer is just putting all of his pieces into better positions. If you kind of look from black right here, after the queen comes over here to g5, all of his pieces are just kind of protecting each other. Nothing's really active. There's no real attack that he has. And white, all of his pieces are aimed at either the center of the board or at the king side. If you look at all these bishops, they're all lined up right here. So Bobby Fischer now plays queen to f3. Didn't really have to do this. He had other options here. He could have tried something, like rook here to b7. You always want to get your rooks on the 7th rank. They can just add so much pressure to your opponent. You're attacking right here on e7. Later on the bishop could come here to d5. Nice little outpost for him. So definitely had this nice little move that I think he missed. Instead he played queen here to f3. Wanted to make sure that he was protecting this pawn here on e4 from the knight, coming there and taking. Now the knight's going to come over here to d7. Less active square for black. Attacking the knight, but it's not really doing a whole heck of a lot, considering that the rook can just come here to b7. And this is exactly where Bobby Fischer wants his rook, is on the 7th rank, putting a lot of pressure on his opponent. But James Sherwin now brings his knight here to e5. Nice little outpost move, recognizing that Bobby Fischer's probably not going to exchange his bishop off, since it's an open board and bishops tend to do better, especially later game in an open game, since they just control more of the board right here. So recognizing this is going to be a nice little outpost for black. And then the queen just comes back here to e2. Nice little safe move from Bobby Fischer. Doesn't want to have to exchange off, and considering his queen is being attacked, he definitely has to move it. Now, although we talked about the reasons why Bobby Fischer might not want to get rid of his bishop, it still probably would have been a decent move for Bobby Fischer just to take with his bishop here on e5. After the queen takes or the pawn takes, if we look at it, the pawn takes here on e5, Bobby Fischer still has more aggressive pieces. He has his bishop and his queen and his rook all lined up on this f7 square right here. Also, his rook on b7 is very active. So, although he brought his queen back, and that's not the worst move ever, he still would have had a very good game if he took with his bishop here on e5. But if we come back here, after the knight comes to e5, the queen's going to come down to e2, and then the bishop comes to f6. Wants to make sure it's still not being harassed by this rook here on b7. Definitely needs to get it to a better square. And then the queen's going to come over here to h1. Wants to make sure, since he doesn't have a pawn here on f2, that later into the game he doesn't have to deal with, let's say this knight moved and then the bishop took here on d4 and there'd be a check. Wants to make sure that he just has his king in a very safe position. Now the pawn's going to push forward on a5. If you kind of look at this from black, what is he really going to do? He needs to have some sort of counterattack. Yes, both sides are even in material, but white's just way more aggressive. So he needs to find some sort of counterattack, and pawn a4, attacking on the queen side, is really all that he has right now. White's now going to play bishop to d5, and this is a great move from Bobby Fischer. You always need to be looking out for outposts for your pieces, and this is a great outpost for his bishop here on d5. Not only is it in the center of the board, so he can control all the light squares on the board, but also once this rook move, he does have a discovered attack on the rook here on a1. So again, as you're playing your own games, Bobby Fischer does a great job showing us, in this game in particular, we'll see more of that later on, but all these fundamentals in chess that he just plays to perfection. Now the rook's going to come over here to c8, again controlling this long file as we talked about, much better than just over here on rook to a8. Also, because of the discovered attack when the rook moves on b7, being attacked by the bishop here on d5, definitely wants to make sure that he moves that rook. Now Bobby Fischer is going to bring his bishop back down to c3, making sure that this rook can't, come down to, c1, since he does have the protection here from the queen here on g5 on c1. So kind of blocking it off right here. Outpost on c3 is not nearly as impressive or aggressive as here on d5, but it does block off this rook. So it kind of makes the attack right away from black somewhat null and void. Black's now going to play pawn to a4, again pushing the pawn. It is also being attacked by the bishop here on c3, so wants to move it out of the way. And then Bobby Fischer plays rook over to a7, attacking his pawn here a4. He does have, in my opinion, a more aggressive move that he could have played. Queen to a6 makes a lot of sense right here. Not only putting pressure on the pawn on a4, but also the pawn to d6. And the queen's not really needed. This pawn's not being attacked anymore by the knight, and his rook on f1 is completely safe, doesn't have to worry too much about it. And since this rook's not going to be doing any harm, this queen to a6 is a very, very strong move from Bobby Fischer. But in the game, he played rook over to a7, which seems logical. Attacking this rook on a4, it's going to be really hard for black to defend this pawn. And so black now plays knight over here to g4. Recognizing that, okay, he can't do a whole heck of a lot, but also opening up the door for a discovered attack on the bishop here on c3. Bobby Fischer now plays rook taking on a4. In this position, I really feel like he has to play bishop here to d2. Because of the exchange that we'll see here in a second, it just leaves Bobby Fischer in a bad spot. In this position, he's attacking the queen here on g5. Black's going to have to respond with this. He can't take a move, bishop here to b2. This is going to be horrible. He has to take care of this, and then after the queen moves, the rook can come down here on a4 and take. That's going to be completely fine. In the game, Bobby Fischer took right away. Wasn't really looking for kind of the in-between move, and took with his rook on a4. And then after the bishop took and the pawn took, the rook's going to come down here to c3. And in this position, both sides are actually equal. Black has a very aggressive position. Obviously, his rook here on c3 is much more aggressive than it was here on c8. Later on, he can swing his rook over to c8, get those involved into the game. Again, his queen is eyeing down on the c1 file, so you can always play backup if the rook comes down further. So this is not going to be a terrible position for black at all, and white's really going to have to find a nice attack to continue. Luckily for white, it's being played by one of the greatest chess players of all time. Even at the age of 14, he just saw the game so well. And Bobby Fischer played the rook takes here on f7. This is just a really hard move for black to deal with. Now he could play something, like pawn to h5, which is probably the best move just because it allows, if this rook moves, the king can come here to h7 if he needs to. Starting to attack on the king side here. Again, really hard move to find in the game. Black actually played rook to c1, giving up any equality or advantage that black may have had. And what he probably saw is, this is going to be completely fine. I'm checking Bobby Fischer. So after the rook comes down, there's a discovered attack, and the king's just going to come up over here to h8, and then black's going to be fine. He's going to be in an aggressive position, but if the rook comes here, then the queen's going to recapture on c1. Black's looking really good right here. Again, he has his rook on f8 ready to get involved into the game. What he didn't see was a nice little deflection move from Bobby Fischer, and it's queen here to f1. And this is huge because if the rook captures here on f1, then the rook can come down on f1 check because of the discovered attack. And then let's say if the queen takes here on d5, there's not a whole lot of options. Then the rook can take on f8, and then after the king takes, then the pawn takes, and this is going to be an easy game for Bobby Fischer. Obviously, he's up in material, not only from the major minor piece, but he does have this pass pawn right here that he can easily push forward, and it's going to be good game for Bobby Fischer. So in that position, after the queen came here to f1, black decided, okay, I can't really exchange pieces. I'm going to have to figure something else out to do. So instead he plays the pawn here to h5, which seems reasonable. Again, he wants to, it's a little too late though, but he recognizes he needs some sort of counterattack. Unfortunately, he now found a nice little decoy move from Bobby Fischer, and it's queen takes here on c1, recognizing that the queen can't take here on c1, or the rook can just come here to f1. Again, it was a nice little decoy on c1, but after the decoy was taken, and there is a discovered attack on the king, then the rook can just come over here to c1 and take that queen. So recognizing this, black plays queen here to h4, trying to set up the queen to h2 here for checkmate, recognizing that it's just not going very well. Bobby Fischer just has a huge attack, and he just didn't see that queen to f1 move early on. Bobby Fischer now takes on f8, checking the king, and then after the king comes here to h7, Bobby Fischer plays pawn to h3, stopping the immediate threat of queen to h1 checkmate. The queen's going to come to g3 again, just trying something. Now just trying to play this queen to h2 checkmate. But Bobby Fischer says, not going to allow that. I'm just going to take with my pawn here on g4. And then after the pawn comes to h4, kind of a last-ditch effort, trying to push something forward to protect this queen for the checkmate. Then the bishop's going to come here to e6, protecting the pawn. And from here, black resigns and just said, good game. This is what allowed Bobby Fischer to go on and to win the U.S. championship. So definitely, even at the age of 14, recognizing all of just these tactics in chess as far as getting these discovered attacks, finding these nice little outpost moves in the center of the board, finding nice deflections and decoys. It was just really great to see at a huge stage, first U.S. championship, that he really put on all the chess lessons that he really could on his opponent. So hopefully you guys enjoy this video. Again, we're going to be going over all of Bobby Fischer's greatest moments in chess, and hopefully you guys are enjoying this and learning from these, and I'll see y'all in the next video. Thanks for watching.